All right, so let's go ahead and start putting together the infrastructure we need to be able to save data into the database. That way we can see something like this, right? To be able to save cities that we search for and add them to our database. So we can then, users in this case, can go back and refer to them by clicking and show the information about that city. Okay, so we're going to start, of course, from the beginning. The first thing we need to do is to create that table, right? Or in this case, the model class that will model after a favorite city. Okay, so let's go to our project. A lot of things here. Of course, we have to remember that we must have all of the dependencies that we added earlier. So if you are just now following us, which I hope you are not just now following us, remember that we have already added the room dependencies and everything that we need in order to use room. So that's very important. And so back here, what we need to do, let's go to our model here. So in our model class, I'm going to create a new class. It's just going to be an actual data class, actually. And I'm going to call this favorite. Okay, there we have it. So there's really not much special about this class, except that we need to add some annotations here to tell the room database compiler to know that this is not just any class, but it's also going to be part or will be compiled into an entity. So an entity is a table that we can add into our database. Okay, to do so, it's very simple. Say entity as such. And voila, this tells us that everything is set up in the back end, meaning we have a room dependency and everything. So this entity you can see here says Android X.room, which tells us that it is a room entity. What that means then is that we can pass out a metadata inside. So I can say table name. So I can now say, okay, I want this to be favorite or fav TBL like this, right? I like to always add a TBL for table whenever I create a table. Okay, so now entity is going to run and say, okay, this class is not just any class, it's an entity, which means is in lay terms, it's just a table that can be used with room. Okay, all right, so next here in our constructor, we are going to add a few parameters. We're going to add a few parameters. The first parameter is going to be actually 1. The first parameter is going to be a city, because for a favorite, because we're saving the favorite city, right? The city name. So in this case, it's just going to be a string. And the second one is going to be a country, because I just want to save that to show later that, you know, we have that country code there. Just something I decided to do. All right, same thing, it's going to be a string. Let's not forget to add our commas there. Okay, now this is fine, but it's not complete, because now we have to again add a few annotations here so that room compiler will know what to do with all of this. First of all, every table needs to have some sort of a primary key, right? So that it can reference that key whenever we want to get to that information, right? So it's a unique key in this case. So for us, I'm just going to make this actual primary key, meaning that our city is going to be a primary key. And next here, I'm going to also annotate to say, well, the city is also going to be a column, because we have columns and rows, right, for our tables, entities. So I'm going to say add column info like that and pass in a few metadata here. The name is going to be city. Now, because city and city are the same, they're the same name, I don't really have to add a name if I didn't want to, right? Because they have the same name. The beauty here is that I can create a different column name if I wish to do so, different from the actual field name. But in this case, it's fine. We're just going to keep it that way. And I want to make sure also that is non-null, right? That this primary key city should not be null, meaning we won't be able to save a null for city. Makes sense, because we don't want to save a favorite null city. Okay, and so for country, I'm going to do different. And for a country here, all I have to pass is just the column info and pass the name. I'm just going to say country like this. There we go. And just like that, we've created an entity that we'll use for our room database. Okay. And that's it. In the background, the room compiler will know what to do with everything and set everything up for us. So let's look at the diagram because it's always helpful. So we said that we're going to follow this structure here because it helps us to compartmentalize, to create entities, to create, in this case, layers that will help us in the future if we wish to make this more complex, right? But also it just gives us a scaffolding per se, so that we can use anytime we want to create database, room database, right? So always follow something similar to this, at least. It's very important. Now, we said that in order for us to connect to our database, in order for us to interface with our database, we need to create a DAO. DAO is just any interface class that access our object. So data access object, which means all it does, it has the functions that will allow us to do all the queries, all the reading, updating, and so forth to our SQLite database, which in turn has entities. Okay, so we are working here in this area right now. Let's go ahead and create a DAO. So for our DAO, I'm going to create that inside of our data. Okay, so my new Kotlin class, and it's going to be an interface. So I'm going to say weather DAO, and notice the naming is very important here, right? The app is weather and DAO is data access object. It's very important to have these naming conventions here because then it's easy for us to know what this is when we look at it. Okay, so weather DAO, what do we do? Well, the first thing we need to do, of course, is to make sure, again, annotate it to say this is a DAO class. Right? It's an Android X room DAO, and so Android will know exactly what this is in the background. Okay. And here is where we're going to add all of the queries and all sort of things that we need to interface with our database. Because in database, really all we're doing is creating an item, is updating that item, is deleting that item, is so create, read, update, delete. CRUD. That's all we're doing. Okay. So we need to create the infrastructure. In this case, it's an interface. So we need to create the classes, or in this case, the functions that will do that. So the first one is going to be get favorites. In this case, the fun, get favorites, right? To get a favorite from our database. And in this case here, I'm going to make it so that the list, because we want to receive all of that as a list of favorites. So I'm going to say list of what? Favorite objects. In this case, it's going to be favorite objects. But this is not enough because remember, with Compose, we need to wrap our data, especially when we're getting our data, because now we're talking about composables that respond to the changes of our data. We need to wrap this inside of a structure, data structure that will allow this reactivity of our data. Now, we've seen mutable state, we've seen other kinds of structure, data structure that allow us for that. Now we're going to use a new one called flow. Now I found that flow works really well with a room database. So I'm not going to use mutable state or anything. Flow is what works well so far. So I'm going to wrap all of that with flow. So if you hover over, let's go ahead and import flow, Kotlin flow. There we go. Very good. Now, there's a lot about flow that I'm not going to get into it, but if you hover over, it says is an asynchronous data stream that sequentially emits values and completes normally or with exceptions and so forth, right? And there's a lot about it and you can read more about it, but essentially think of just a stream of data that we're going to stream out to whoever wants to use it. Now, this is not it actually, because we need to do something else. As you know, we are talking about room database. That means we need to annotate to make it known that this is indeed a query we're doing to, so that it's known that this is indeed a query we are performing to our database. And luckily, we can do that by saying @query. Look at that. Make sure we get the correct query from the correct dependency, from the correct namespace. So we want the Android X room query like this, which allows us to pass, of course, as you know by now, certain values. I'm going to say values for value in this case. In fact, I don't have to pass anything like this, but it's implicit there. You can see it's a value that we can pass here. What is it that we're going to pass? Well, we're going to pass the actual query, SQLite, SQL query here, command that will allow us to get data from the database. So all you have to do, we just say select, all caps. Doesn't have to be all caps, but I like to follow that convention. And asterisk to say select all, and then I say from, well, from where? For our database. But how do I get database? This is the beauty. Because Room Database is sophisticated, all the classes know of each other. If you just start typing like FAV, remember, this is the name of the table we created earlier when we created that entity favorite class. Right? Very good. So I can just hit enter and voila. So all we're saying that now is that, okay, when this is called get favorites, right, it will know that it needs to go and query the database and get everything from our favorite table and return a list of favorite objects in a stream of flow. That's it. Right? Very easy. Of course, I'm going to create another one here. Let's say suspend. Now this one is suspend because I'm going to create a different query that requires to run on the background. Okay. So, and also is not returning essentially a flow. So a flow will take care of all of the background coroutines and everything that we usually have to worry about when we're getting data from anywhere else. So suspend, I'm going to say get fav by ID. Now we're not going to use this. I'm just going to give you a full picture here, right? Let's say I want to get my favorite city by its ID. The ID is going to be city, right? A string like this that they pass, and I want to return a favorite object. And of course, I'm going to do the same thing. It's going to be a query, and for the value, I'm going to say select all from our fav table. But then I'm going to put a clause here, say where, right? Where what? Where city, in this case, is going to be equal, and put colon like this, equal to city. Now, this is the syntax. It looks really weird, but what it was saying here is that we want to get the city where, from our table, of course, favorite tables, where a city, whatever we're passing here, is going to be equal to this city, whatever we're passing in our get fav by ID. Okay, so we do this syntax to say we're going to pass a query, we're going to pass an actual value that we want to get from our database, which is going to be a favorite object. So this is syntax weird, I know, but that's how we do it. We're going to continue. Let's go now and insert, right? Let's say we want to insert, obviously we need to insert something to our database. Well, to do that, I'm going to use suspend function again, call this insert favorite, and I'm going to insert a favorite object. Obviously, we don't need to return anything, and that's all. Well, not necessarily, because we need to tell, of course, the compiler what needs to happen in the background. In this case, I'm going to say insert annotation. Look how easy this is, right? So what I can do now here to insert, I could leave it as it is, but I can also say, well, on conflict, if there's some conflict trying to insert something that already exists, all I'm going to do, I'm going to invoke the on conflict strategy and say, just go ahead and replace that. So if we're inserting a favorite that already exists like Cancun, the database is just going to go and delete whatever we had before and insert that new data, well, new favorite in this case, new city. Let's continue. The next one is going to be suspend also, and this is going to be update favorite. Again, we're not going to use some of these, but I'm just going to add them so we have a complete picture. We don't need to return anything, which is always nice, but we're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to go and pass update. Look at that, very easy. And again, I'm going to pass some information, metadata, say on conflict. Again, I'm going to use a different strategy. So on conflict strategy and replace like this. The same thing we did there. Let's make sure it's favorite like this. And I'm going to continue here. Let's say I want to delete, because that's one thing that we want to do. Let's say I want to delete everything. So I'm going to suspend and say delete all favorites. I need to pass anything, right? Delete everything. I'm just going to put a query. In this query, I'm going to go ahead and add the delete from our fav table. So this will just delete everything from our database, which usually is not what we want to do, but hey, sometimes one must do what needs to do. All right, and the other one we're going to do, which is important also, is the delete one favorite, because we're actually going to use this. So let's suspend. Here, I'm going to say delete favorite. As such, and I'm going to delete past the favorite object that we're going to be deleting. And I'm just going to go ahead and say delete, just call delete, and voila, that's it. Now, looking at this, if this is the first time that you've worked with databases, Room database in Android, you will realize how far we've come in Android. Because before, we had to write a lot of boilerplate code, a lot of classes, complicated stuff just to get things to work with database SQLite. This is what we do with Room database. Because Room database, again, it simplifies our lives. It abstracts out all the things that we had to do before, all the classes we had to create, all the transactions and so forth. All we have to do is just pass in the queries as annotation and leave it all to Room to deal with everything in the background. Okay, very good. So just take your time to marvel at all of this. This should be favorite a bit. Let's see, favorite, not favorite, favorite, or whatever that was. Okay. All right, so take your time to marvel at this if this is the first time, and this is great. Okay, so next we are going to continue and see where this weather DAO is going to be called and how all fits together. So we're still following this structure here, right? This Room database structure to set ourselves up for success.